Now we'll shift to Emily. We can now see you, Emily. Good morning. We're very sorry you aren't able to join us, but okay. So Emily Polack from IIED, who works with Lorenzo Cotula, and their team has worked a lot on land tenure systems with case studies in Africa and so on. That's what we've asked her to speak on. Over to you, Emily.
Okay, good morning. And it's a shame I couldn't be there, and a shame I can't see you now, but thank you for the invite, and I'm glad I can participate in some way, and we can be involved. I think this follows on quite nicely from the previous two speakers. The first speaker in particular, this presentation draws on work looking at national land regimes, policy frameworks, and local realities in a number of African countries. I think some of what was talked about in the second presentation is reflected in recent work of IIED looking at trends and drivers, diversity of deals, who are the national players, and things around negotiating power. But really this presentation we've taken looking at the local level perspective. What are some of the land tenure regimes that we come across, and what are the implications? Specifically, I was asked to look at what tools are we using to analyse these issues, and then what kind of responses would there be from donors, in particular in this case, what would be some of the likely recommendations. So the second slide expands on the question, to what extent and how do prevailing land tenure regimes secure local land access in the face of increasing land-based investments? So it's very much bringing work that we've done up to the present context with increasing investments, and that diagram there just sets out the actors, but also highlights that there's no implication that any of these groups are homogeneous. So we've heard about this, typologies of investors, and similarly at the local level, local landholders are diverse and different. And of course, in different countries, different contexts, you have different forms of land tenure. And really, this diagram just says, local landholders are our entry point, and how do the regimes position them vis-à-vis investors and their own governments. The third slide I won't dwell on, but it's really just to take us back to say, how are we defining land tenure? And in this case, we're looking at a system of rights, rules, institutions, processes under which land is held, used, managed, and transferred and transacted. And what that's really saying is that we're not looking just at full legal systems and legal registration, but also what we see across much of Africa is customary systems that are still the dominant forms of accessing and transferring land, and whether that's recognised in national law or not. And then often we talk about land security and land insecurity, and there's been a lot of involvement a lot of evolving legislation to try and recognise customary authorities and land tenure, and you see these systems of legal pluralism, which has implications for local landholders. I've just given a number of definitions for what we mean by secure access, but also what's the rationale for this. And we've heard already this morning about the use of a lease for petrol. So for safety nets and for agriculture, and that's aside for the significance of land for landholders in a broader sense. But in terms of inclusive and sustainable development, very much looking at what land tenure security can mean for investing in agriculture. The work that we'd be drawing on would be a number of case studies that we've looked at in several countries, looking at land tenure and local rights of landholders in the context of investments in biofuels, and a variety of investments in Mozambique, Tanzania and Mali in particular, but there's more to draw on. And what these case studies have really demonstrated is the high level of diversity in tenure regimes, that there is no single approach, and that's likely to have very different implications in the context of this new wave of investments. And even where laws are in many ways very progressive, we see in Mozambique and Tanzania recognition for customary rights, for collective ownership of land, and this can be very significant, but what we see in many cases is that there are clear indications that the processes of land acquisitions by national or foreign investments are not showing that these laws have teeth, and that land tenure is far from secure in many cases. So we then need to look at, okay, so what are these regimes and how can they be strengthened in favour of local landholders? So where consultation is legally required in Mozambique, when you look on the ground, what has happened, often it is weak. Similar where environmental social impact assessments are required, the processes are weak, or the transaction takes place beforehand. In any case, even where customary land use is recognised, often people are still required to prove productive use of land, which is not necessarily relevant in a lot of customary systems, farming systems. Other dimensions of this, what is the role of local institutions, the level of decentralisation in land management, is another aspect that influences tenure security in this context. So we've heard in the previous presentation about the role of middlemen at the local level and who do they negotiate with. In terms of lenses to analyse some of these questions and analyse security in this context, we look really both at substantive and procedural rights in current prevailing regimes, and the ways in which they influence the negotiating power and position of local landholders vis-à-vis other interests. So this is a possible approach, the approach that we take, looking at the substantive legal recognition of rights of different users, so not just farmers in general, but looking particularly at women or pastoralists or sharecroppers, and how does this work in practice as well as in policy, and reflected in the law. And similarly, the procedural rights, how is consultation taking place, how should it be taking place, what is the level of transparency at every level in contract negotiation, and perhaps significantly, what are the processes around identifying available land, who is involved, what are the classifications, and how does that affect negotiating power. Some of these provisions, as we heard, will also be required by lenders, and so investors will, it's in their interest to see due process in these cases, but a lot of the cases that we've looked at, there are obviously some significant weaknesses in the processes. So I've just to that diagram at the start, just to say this is our entry point at this stage, but of course there are a whole set of other relationships which are guided by other frameworks. So in summary, to come to what some of the outputs or recommendations would be, and particularly for donors. Obviously, European donors have done some important, long-standing work on strengthening tenure security in 4 different groups in different contexts. IIED was involved in providing guidance in the 2004 guidelines on land tenure. And really that still provides an important reference point, and a lot of the work that has been trying to develop appropriate, accessible, low-cost approaches that recognise diverse rights, secondary rights, overlapping land use rights, common property. There's a substantial body of work on that now and experiences. However, there is still a big push in a lot of cases for systematic titling of individual land, And if we look at that in the current context, there are some serious challenges to actually securing tenure in the face of large-scale and small-scale investments, particularly in the time frame. You see that a lot of these schemes are lengthy and extremely costly. And so there's really a need to think again and say that those may be needed for a long-term approach, but there may be some shorter-term rethinking that needs to be done on how collective and customary land can be recognised. So it's really a matter of continuing some work, but thinking also about how do we strengthen some of these government processes to fulfil substantive and procedural rights, and particularly looking at processes of consultation and also compensation. How is land valued? How is it attributed to different groups, and how does that compensation get delivered? And that's really the nub of looking at local landholders in terms of strengthening contracts amongst and agreements amongst different actors. That's another set of work we could talk on. But I'll leave it there in terms of this presentation. Okay, thank you.